welcome back to the We're So Bloody Early podcast. Today we have Mr. John Vallis on the show. Welcome, John.
Gents, how are you?
Yeah, we're very well. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. So, as per usual, we'd just love to kick off at a very high level. Just give us a little introduction as to what you're up to today and what you work on. And then we'll probably take a step back and go on a more historical or chronological order as to how you became who you are today. So yeah, for the listeners that we have, we'd love to know a little bit more about yourself, please, John.
Sure. Well, I host a podcast called Bitcoin Rapid Fire. And I started it out of necessity, really. I was living in Thailand at the time, taking some time off. And the obsession for Bitcoin had been growing for several years. And not wanting to drive everyone in my immediate vicinity insane, I needed an outlet for these sort of thoughts and conversations. And so I started the podcast. And yeah, I mean, I think what I like to explore or what I try to focus on are the more meaningful aspects of this. There's a lot of people out there that are happy to talk about the investment case and Sharpe ratios and macroeconomic stuff. And I'm interested in that to a certain degree, but as many of us are starting to realize, the rabbit hole goes much deeper. And my natural inclination and interest has led me to try to explore some of those aspects. And, a lot focuses lately on how interacting with and understanding and engaging with Bitcoin and the Bitcoin quote unquote community is seeming to have a fairly transformative effect on a lot of people's lives. And I like to explore why that is. And then most recently, I published a piece, my first kind of, major quote unquote piece in the Bitcoin article space. And that was called Money Messiah, and subtitle, God, Bitcoin, and the Evolution of Consciousness. So dealing with very light themes. And, that was my attempt to articulate some of these, the convergence of a lot of these thoughts that I've been having and these conversations I've been having with people around the depths of the rabbit hole, and try to do so in a way, try to give it the proper treatment. We're dealing with with topics and themes here of the utmost significance of how people orient their lives. And I wanted to try to tease out the thoughts that were occurring in my mind and rationalize them for myself. And then obviously try to articulate them in a way that, more than anything, I mean, the whole purpose of the piece was, one, clarifying my own thoughts, and then two, trying to invite discussion around these themes, by no means making the assertion that this, everything that I put forward there is absolutely true, but I think they're directionally true. And I want to invite discussion and feedback and counter arguments and all that kind of stuff, so that we can continue to inch closer to, capital T truth, let's say, around this stuff. And so that was a big effort, because writing is tough, and especially when you're dealing with things that are, right on the edge of comprehension and understanding, and that bring together so many different fields. But it was also very fulfilling. So I think I'll probably do more of that kind of stuff in the future. And, and then the last bit is, I'm a remnant refugee in the world today, looking for a little bit of freedom and finding it hard to find. And so I move around quite a bit to try to find the pockets of life where freedom is still prioritized, or at least respected to some degree. And, hopefully that proliferates as Bitcoin proliferates. That's the thesis, at least.
Where do you see that now with the way the world is? Those pockets of freedom.
Like, where are they, or how do I feel about them?
No. Where do you see them? Where are they? Like, from your opinion?
We're in Melbourne, which has been the most locked down city in the world.
Oh, Jesus.
So we're kind of desperate for this information. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been keeping my current location.
And that's fine. We don't want exact locations.
No, I know.
But
my rationale just being, I don't want to field all the questions and, the spot to be blown up and the little slice of freedom I found to be invaded. But, I've traveled around a lot in recent months and in Central America. I mean, red state US, obviously, those, that's, I think, the best places to be: Florida, Texas, Idaho, Wyoming. And then, seems to be countries and jurisdictions where the law has historically been more difficult to enforce, not in the developed countries like Canada and the US, or Canada and Australia and Germany, et cetera, where people basically have to kind of follow the law and it is enforced, in places like Mexico and Costa Rica and Nicaragua, like, money talks. And if you're in a rural environment, kind of minding your own business, then you're probably going to be insulated from a lot of the mandates or laws that come down the pike. Yeah. Now, it's great to see jurisdictions like El Salvador. Well, El Salvador is a particularly special case, as we all know, but El Salvador and Mexico and Colombia and Costa Rica and some other places that either didn't have entry requirements from, almost the start, or lifted them very early and weren't too overbearing with policies. And we see a lot of Bitcoiners that aren't American and who can't spend extended periods of time in the US, flocking to these places. So there's these little pockets of remnants kind of growing, and it's great. It's awesome to hang out with other Bitcoiners that left oppressive environments in their home country and are dedicated to being free and not being locked down and all of these things, and contributing to the emergence of Bitcoin and having those conversations and those barbecue meals and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's as much as I lament how insane things have gotten. First of all, I mean, this was kind of always what I expected. Of course, I didn't know exactly how the details of everything would play out, but this was on the horizon for a lot of us. And even though it's frustrating in terms of how maddening and insane everything is, there's also an excitement to it that, this is happening and it's real and it's consequential. And hopefully it calls forth the best in all of us to try to, one, stick to our principles, and two, actually find ways and build solutions to overcome what we deem to be unjust, and, foster a more peaceful, prosperous, and free world for everyone.
Very inspiring, John, listening to you, I have to say. Yeah, I mean, so I have a question. So this is slightly kind of steering us back towards, where it all began perhaps, but you've spoken already of the mentality change of people through what is this innovation, discovery, however you want to frame Bitcoin. Just from your own personal journey, how much has your thinking changed since you came across this technology? And perhaps you could just spell us out a little bit as to, like, how you previously saw the world, and then you found out about it, and how that's evolved over time to where you are clearly today, hunting for freedom, as you say, and happy to move around, etc. Yeah,
sure. This may sound like a douchey comment, but I feel like I've been a Bitcoiner my whole life. I've always prioritized freedom. I've always wanted to establish as much independence as I could. I wanted to shore up any vulnerabilities I had, whether that's, physical vulnerabilities or dependencies of various kinds. Like, I basically, since the time, I was in high school, like, my vision for the ideal future was already that, like, self-sufficient cabin in the woods, with only people that you really like around, and being strong and being, self-sufficient, and being able to pursue what I felt was meaningful and interesting and all that kind of stuff. And I would say, and those are pretty common motivations or changes that you see in people that come into Bitcoin, right? Like, they start changing their diet and their lifestyle and their approach to health and relationships and philosophy, political philosophy and spirituality and all this kind of stuff. And I had been refining all that pretty much for my whole life, and I think ultimately at a detriment to, what otherwise would have been a greater immersion in the various careers that I spent some time in, because I was always so enthralled in the former. So I would say the way in which I've been most transformed is I was very critical of, for lack of a better term, how the world worked, from a very young age. I've always been very curious. And so that led me to reading and consulting, pretty much every resource on every subject that I could get my hand on. And when you do that, if you read about, I remember just having these gargantuan Amazon orders, when I was in my early 20s, right? And they come to the house and it would be, inside the FDA, the Israel lobby, what's up with our food? Like, it's just everything, right? And of course, it's difficult to parse truth, and it still is, right? And so you have to try to walk the tightrope of not believing every critical thing that you hear about any institution in society today, but finding some manner by which you are able to construct a perspective based on truth and optimally mediate, your life. And that's an ongoing process. It's always very difficult. But for me, what it led to was being very critical and I guess ultimately somewhat dejected about the state of the world. And I felt that I didn't see how it could all be turned around, and so that inevitably, even though like I think naturally I'm kind of an eternal optimist, and I always knew that even if the world was dark and shitty, I could construct pockets of beauty and light and joy in my own life, and that's what I attempted to do. But I didn't see how the whole thing could get turned around. And from a finance and investment perspective, that means I became a gold bug, which is one of the more regrettable, it's never been fun in the history to be a gold bug. You're always kind of just mad at the world with no viable solution. And like the messed up mental thing that you have to confront is that your thesis is actually hoping for like the fall of society. That's when your thesis plays out. So as a result of all that, I kind of lost myself for a few years, to be honest. Like I was living in Shanghai at the time, and I wanted to be in Shanghai because I felt like it was New York at the turn of the 19th century, right? Early 1900s. And it just, I think what it changed with me is there was no greater purpose. And that just leads you down a road of various forms of behavior that's basically congruent with that, and again, all encompassing might be a form of nihilism where you just don't care as much as you otherwise could, or that you have the capacity to care. And what I think it was so transformative with regards to Bitcoin for me and understanding it and the implications of it and the potential of it was that it allowed me to see how the world could be improved, and not just in pockets, but how it could be, structurally and fundamentally improved. And, that is a very powerful thing, because you go from a friction between like maybe your natural disposition and what you want in the world and what the world is showing you, and not really wanting to be congruent with it, right? Like you look out on the world and you say, oh, this is corrupt and it's inefficient and it's unfair and all that kind of stuff. Like that's not something I even want to excel in. I don't want to be excellent in that world, really. And I know that's a little bit too broad, but that can sometimes be the mentality that it inspires in people. And then with the emergence of Bitcoin and seeing how much of a fundamental level it's going to influence the institutions and the and the cultures and all the different behaviors that are downstream of the fundamental base layer, which is money, seeing how they could, fix so many things, then you become congruent with the hope for the future that thing has inspired. And I think that's what's happening to a lot of us. We realize that the world is super fucked up. I mean, look at where we are now and what we just said, but we see how it can be fixed now. We see that there is now a solution, and that's generated in me, just a tremendous reinvigoration of hope. And what happens as a result of that is like all that latent potential in you, and whether that potential might be expressed or contained in different ways, but like it pulls it out, right? And so like whether it's intellectual stimulation or expression or pursuing different lines of thought or reasoning or meaning or building different things, whatever it might be for you, knowing that there's something on the horizon calling it forth, and that it's perhaps nothing has ever called it forth more strongly, and that it's worthy of your effort and your pursuit, and that it's good, and all those different things really serve to reorient my perspective, at least, and to one where all the effort and all the work and all the turmoil and all the struggle and stress is actually worth it now because of what potential exists. And of course, it's by no means a guarantee, but that we have such a powerful ally in our efforts to have the changes that we make in ourselves manifest as improvements both in us and in the world, that we have a tool that now facilitates that and amplifies that to such a degree. It's like, it's difficult to imagine something more exciting. And so there's there's a vibrance brought back to life that where there was, an apathy or a nihilism before.
It's literally life changing.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's bringing also the, my problem is that it's accountability. There's just no accountability anymore. Anyone can put out anything, and that tightrope that you have to walk between reading something and making up your own mind is just not there, because anyone can put out anything. Whereas Bitcoin or the blockchain, once everything's on that, people are accountable for what they're saying and what they're putting out.
Yeah. And, we exist in the messy phase where we're coming out of a culture, a global culture and society that has so much corruption and dishonesty and disingenuousness and untruth that, like, it is it's a big task for all of us to parse all of that and try to, walk that path as best we can. But like, so much has to be reevaluated and reconstructed and reconstituted, because so much was built on a faulty foundation, and everything that bubbled up from that was in most cases in some way not the way it should be, not grounded in truth, let's say. And so of course it seems as though, a lot of the opinions held in Bitcoin are antithetical to a lot of the opinions held in normie world. And of course they would, because the foundation of normie world, fiat, and Bitcoin are basically antithetical to one another. And so it's natural that the behaviors and the signals that both of those foundations would send and permeate through it, human behavior in different societies, would be very different. And of course we're seeing that. And that's why I think it seems like Bitcoiners are like a bit of a rough bunch. And there's a lot of friction between Bitcoiners and normie world, which there is, but I think it's misinterpreted as just being disagreeable rather than, coming out of, the lies and deception and trying to discern and trying to ground our perception and our behavior in truth. And when you're coming from such a place of noise and deception and lack of clarity, that process can seem very divergent, and it is, but I think it's very worthwhile. And that's why I think we're all here and we're starting to recognize that. And so much of the attention gets shifted back on us as a result. We realize, like, we can't go out and, I'm sure we've all tried to orange pill people in our lives, but like that's fun. And those conversations happen and whatever. But like, the real rub here is us. It's about our perspective and what we do with our time and our resources and our life, and how we apply ourselves and what our values are and what principles we're willing to stand by. And it's those decisions, melded to or supported by this network around which everyone else is coalescing, that's going to foster emergent change over the course of time. And I don't see it. I can't see it happening any other way. That's the only chance, really. So
it's very cool,
isn't it? That's what Jeff Booth says.
You have a question?
That's what Jeff Booth says. He says the same thing. You can't see it right now any other way. Like, it's yeah. I found trying to orange pill people as well that I just stopped doing that, because there's always pushback from those normies, and with the same silly arguments. So what I do is I just lead by example. And I mean, like, as Jake knows, I went into retirement because of Bitcoin back in 2020. I'm 41 years old. Sorry, how old are you? Just my standard question. And I'm retired, and people just look at me and go like, how can you be retired? You never went to university. You did, like, how is this possible? And I just do it for my kids. I'm just home 24/7, and just lead by example and let my actions do the talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most powerful thing anyways. We've all, before it was Bitcoin, for me, it was psychedelics, right? That's been an integral part of my own development and explorations. And, it's not dissimilar in that once you get it, you want to grab people by the collar and like make sure they understand what it is. But
you feel like you're trying to help people, but they don't want your help, like.
Yeah, I mean, and you, like, a lot of it is hard to articulate with even words, right? And so the most powerful, as you say, I mean, the most powerful persuasion is always example, right? When they see you, pursuing things that are meaningful to you, not a soul-sucking job, and you're building a family maybe, or you're taking care of your health, you have better relationships in your life, or you're more hopeful for the future, or yada, 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 all that stuff.
Yeah.
That's the stuff that people perk up and go, what the fuck is he like? How the fuck is he like that? I mean, like, doesn't he have the same stresses and problems? Yeah, exactly. And then, if they're interested enough, maybe they come to you, or maybe they pursue their own journey of understanding and education. But, like we're not going to convince anyone or many people with our words, and I think that's a fool's errand anyways. Like I'm way more, because we don't know either, like we're in the middle of this. So I don't have many answers, if any, and I don't feel comfortable giving advice really, because I'm still trying to figure out what the proper orientation here is, both, with regards to Bitcoin and with my own life and with relationships and all this kind of stuff. And I think what's fun about this emerging culture around Bitcoin is that part of all of our interactions on Twitter, on these podcasts and stuff, is like, we're all trying to determine like what kind of frame of reference, what point is best to construct all those other perceptions and opinions and knowledge about things. And we're constantly just, trying to refine it, like take in more information, shift the perspective a little bit, see if that feels better, if it works better, move forward, learn. I mean, that's the other thing, man. It's crazy how, because I think, there's many reasons for this, and, we could chew up 3 hours discussing it, but I think one of the things that happens when people realize that, like, pretty much, I hate to be hyperbolic, but pretty much like when you're unplugged from the matrix, you realize that things are not as you thought they were originally. Things function differently, and they can function differently. But when you realize that, you feel or a lot of people do, including myself, feel such a hunger to learn more about how everything works. And so, like, part of this crazy Bitcoin community that's happening is like, incompetence and being uninformed is like poo-poo, right? And not is like, people want to learn more. Like, I find myself reading about, I hated physics in high school, right? But I find myself reading about it because now that information might be relevant to my attempts at understanding other things like Bitcoin, or maybe political philosophy, because now that's relevant because we're in this, multi-generational shift of what human organization is going to look like. And I want to have an informed opinion about that stuff. And I want to be able to see truth when I listen to these conversations and read these things. So, we're just this, it's revivification is, I think, one of the best ways to describe it, because we're like, now everything, because the change that we're confronting is the magnitude is so large, so much information that was previously irrelevant to us, to our narrow scope of interest or behavior, has now ballooned, so now so much information is relevant so that we can properly contextualize and move forward to that hopeful future that I mentioned before. And that's awesome, to be so stimulated. And of course, again, like, you're always walking a bit of a tightrope. Like, how do you manage your time when you want to know everything there is to know? Like, that requires some discipline and some parameters and stuff like that. But just to be involved in a group of people that are acting like that, and that are kind of, there's some brinksmanship there. You're inspiring one another to be that way, and to be open, but also not apathetic about the validity of your opinion, and to be happy to let it go to war and do battle with others so that you can refine it and wind up with a better one. I mean, it's such a cool thing to be a part of.
I can kind of I can literally feel your energy, John, coming through the video call here. It's extraordinary, like how profound this moment is in so many ways. Like, it's completely engaging people's creative brains and going. But
it's not engaging on one level. It's engaging on so many different levels. I mean, absolutely. Like Mark Moss, Mark Moss is one of my mentors, and he said to me, he goes, "Your network is your net worth." And I was like, shit. Maybe I've just been so used to the people and surround myself with these people that I thought were my role models. And this is where Bitcoin completely changed that. The community, the people here like yourself, just inspire and revive you, that you just want to do so much more. When I got married, I thought, fuck, I was around that, all the terrorists that were going around and chopping everyone's heads off. What were they?
Some nutters.
ISIS?
ISIS. And I said to my wife, I said, I don't want to bring a kid into this world. This world's fucked. And then, I found running, and I thought, there's some good people still left in this world. And then Bitcoin comes along. And I said to my wife, I said, let's have 5 or 6 kids. The world has a chance here.
Yeah.
It changes your perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much. And what's so cool, like the some people don't like the word community, but look, like we're all obviously converging on this system and the values that are built into it, right? And so whatever you want to call that. But what's cool is that even though people sometimes are criticized for, you know, being a little bit standoffish, a little bit harsh, a little bit rough around the edges, what I think is so cool is that the principles are being more properly hierarchically organized. And by that, I mean, like in fiat land, if you're wealthy and powerful and successful, people will kiss your feet pretty much across the board. You know, I'm sure in all of our careers, we've been at those dinners and those galas and all this kind of shit. And like the person who's most respected and who you don't, you know, ruffle their feathers and stuff is, you know, the rich, successful person or whatever. And that is basically prioritizing in terms of how we value their principles, simply that they accrued wealth, not even how they accrued it. I mean, I know a ton of people that accrued a lot of money in really shitty ways, but just by virtue of the fact that they have done that, they are treated a certain way. And what seems to be happening in Bitcoin is that all of, you know, many of us are saying that's, you know, respect for success and the determination and the, you know, all the things required to get it. But higher above that is honesty and truth. So if you, you know, come in and you're, you know, Mr. Billionaire, whoever you are, Elon Musk, Mark Cuban or whatever, but if your primary value or one of your primary principles isn't honesty and truth, then you will get less, you will garner less respect. And I think that's the way that it should be, you know, not to take anything away from anyone's accomplishments, but if we want to live in a world where we're going to interact with each other and the degree to which we form strong relationships is based on how those principles and values are hierarchically organized, then I think it makes sense. You know, I do value, you know, an honest, truthful pleb more than a billionaire who is not that way, who's not honest, who's not humble, who's not, you know, grounding themselves in truth to the same degree. And so I love it that there's this like irreverent group of people that are, you know, determined to hold people to those principles rather than, you know, carry over from fiat land. And just because you drive a Lambo, you're somehow worthy of the greatest, you know, respect and treatment. You know, I think that's a fun, you know, emergent behavior in this whole thing.
They're characteristics that make a lot of sense from a perspective of society building, you know, in terms of like being honest and being truthful. Perhaps sharing is like another part of that as well, in terms of like building a community. And I don't know, I haven't necessarily heard anyone say anything negative about the phrase community myself, but yeah, John, just to take a slight change in direction, I often find people's journeys to Bitcoin, I mean, all completely unique, but often they had a pain point or they had a skill set that meant that when they looked at it, they go, oh, holy shit, this makes sense. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about your professional career before becoming a Bitcoin podcaster and obviously deciding to start telling everyone about it. Was there anything that you'd experienced in your life that gave you a lens that meant that you got Bitcoin really quickly, or you took a couple of different touch points to understand what it meant? And how does that kind of tie into, you know, clearly deep conviction that you hold today, and the exploration you've done around how we're going to think is awesome. Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I covered some of it already with my background and my general disposition of being a very curious kid. Like you
didn't have like a certain job or something that, you know, meant that you were, you know, able to look at a new type of money and think, oh, this makes sense now.
I wouldn't say it was a kind of money. I mean, if I try to connect the dots of what led me to it, I think there's a couple influences that stand out, and I'll be quick because, you know, this may not be the most exciting story, but I remember when I was playing with one of the, you know, neighborhood kids on the street one day when I was, I don't know, 10, let's say, maybe a bit older, 12, something like that. And she was like above a grade in school, right? And when you're that age, everyone hates school. You don't want to, you know, you want to get out as fast as possible. And I asked her how she did that. And she said, well, I just read a lot. And I was like, what do you mean? If you read a lot, they just like send you up a grade? Like they track how many books you read or something? She was like, no, like I was just more able to do the coursework because I, you know, read a lot. And I was like, but so reading makes you smarter? And she was like, kind of, and I was like mind blown by this epiphany. And so I went home, and, my dad had a big bookshelf, mostly of like business and professional development. And there was some like psychology and philosophy and stuff in there too. And I was just like, well, better get busy, better start reading some of these books. And so I never did skip a grade, but right from that day onward, I just became I read a lot after that. And I also had my dad worked he ran a TV station and radio station when I was a kid. And there was this, like, it was owned by this kind of oddball billionaire type of character, right? Like just super, like was in the sit-in, maybe even organized it with John and Yoko in Montreal, when Give Peace a Chance was recorded, and wrestling alligators in Honduras, and like this type of guy, right? And he would come over and he'd talk about UFOs and the pyramids and all this shit, and it would just blow my fucking mind, right? As a young kid. And so I wonder, is it my curiosity that drew me to all the stories he had, or was it his stories, inspiring the curiosity, or a little bit of both? But the punchline is I think I was never satisfied with, the answers that I received, and always wanted to learn more. And then as a result, I came to being very critical of the way the world worked. But I still had in my mind, like when I was younger, I wanted to, be super rich, and I thought working with money was the way to do it. So I went into wealth management in Shanghai. I got a job in that capacity, even though I had done that just coming out of 4 months backpacking in South America, 6 weeks of which were spent, with a shaman doing ayahuasca several times. And so those are pretty antithetical pursuits. And so I was having feelings that, maybe becoming a billionaire wasn't like the greatest thing to be striving for. But it was this kind of like dream that I couldn't give up on until I'd given it a whirl. So I gave it a whirl for 3 years. It was horrible. The work, the people, it was everything you hear and hate about, high pressure sales environment, wealth management, quote unquote. And I'd always been interested in health and wellness. And I went back to school for 3 years and did a degree in natural medicine, and then went back to Shanghai and worked in a clinic there for a couple of years, but almost a very similar thing, just so much greed that it just overshadowed any altruistic goods you might be able to do. And I'm not naive, right? Like if you're offering a valuable service, you need to be paid. And there's a huge subjective element there. Like how much should you be paid for whatever service you're providing? I mean, it's entirely subjective, but China generally, especially in a certain generation of people, they're just cutthroat, very much so. And so I didn't like that environment. And so I left and spent a year in Thailand and met my girlfriend there. But to answer the question, I don't think it was anything about my job or my history. It was all of my like extracurricular pursuits that led me to realizing that the monetary system was really fucked up. And, like I said, again, gold was the go-to response to that pre-Bitcoin. And then when Bitcoin emerged, I thought it was super cool. My friend and I tried to buy DMT had intended to buy DMT on the Silk Road in like 2011, I think. And so that's when I first came across it. And we pushed out because who wants to have DMT delivered to their house or wherever the fuck you get it delivered to? So, but I remember the hoopla when it hit parity with the US dollar. And, of course, all the regrets that everyone always says at this point in the conversation. But in 2014, I was in Bali, and there was an actual physical Bitcoin store there. And so I finally went in, and because at that point, it wasn't so easy. It wasn't like you have a Swan account or, Amber or whatever it is, where you just stack sats easily. It was kind of complicated. So when there was a physical location, I went in and bought some. And that was when things really started. And, I loved it from the get-go, because I realized the corruptive influence, the inevitable corruption of the money if it's in the hands of the government, and so I recognize it as being a fundamental corrosive influence on culture and humanity at that point. And I wasn't as convicted, right? Because it's so nascent at the time. The market cap was like 10 billion or 15 billion or something like that. And you're like, you don't even realize that, like, can this actually work? Probably not. Like it'll be stopped somehow or whatever. And I think also, as I reflect back on this, one of the things that I think held me back from adopting it sooner was, for all my desire to pursue meaning or truth or all that kind of stuff, I think one of the things that hold me back was like a lack of confidence in myself in a certain domain, right? And in other domains of my life, like there's an extreme form of confidence, but I think I didn't think it was within my capacity to come across and recognize something that, one, could radically change my life, and that, two, could radically change the world. It's like, that's not available to me for some reason. Yeah. And so, it took some time to realize I was wrong in that and act accordingly after I had that realization. But and it's, I can forgive myself, because what we're dealing with here is so unprecedented. I mean, still today, most of the world thinks like, surely this is not possible and this cannot work. Yeah. And maybe they're right. Maybe we're all wrong. That's still a possibility. But I've at least allowed myself to believe, there's an element of faith in all this. And I guess part of my conviction is inherently me saying, I think this is real. I think it's possible. I think it's going to happen. All in,
And John, can I just say that isn't anything but boring story.
It wasn't quick. It wasn't boring.
No, it's so cool though, because everyone's journey to this point is different. Like, everyone is completely unique. Everyone's thought processes, and there's this, wonderful discussion of nature versus nurture. And it's so clear that someone like yourself has a very inquisitive nature. And I particularly like this concept of asking questions. It's okay to ask questions. And for some reason, the world that, at least I found myself in, it was more about obedience. You do this, you get, something else. So whether it's like perform well at school, or, get a good job. And the rat race is very real, but there's no kind of, almost like, when have you've never won, basically. There's always something else that someone else is telling you to do. And so until you take that position of like asking questions, you don't really get into like the nitty gritty of what's going on. And I guess learning about Bitcoin, it requires you to be open to new concepts. It requires you to go and ask questions, and, to be able to share some time with someone like yourself that's clearly in that headspace. It's so cool to then think about, wow, there's, how many Bitcoiners are there globally? It's very hard to know exactly how many people there are who are genuinely using it as a everyday tool and a store of value, and completely believe in its success for the future. But all of those people have had a step change in their mentality. Wow, this is like a radical influence on society, and, as you say, how things will change and be built. Also, I love listening to that. Thank you. Jigsy, I'll let you jump in. Did you have any questions? Or?
Yeah, well, I just
cheers, gents. Cheers.
Cheers. 8 a.m. here. What time is it there?
I'm going to the gym in a minute, so I'm
3. Is it 3 a.m. there? 3 p.m.
Where I am, 3
p.m.
Jigsy, you're showing me up, mate. God damn it,
mate. Last time I think we had who did we have? I think we had Jeff Booth, and we were interviewing at about 9 a.m. and I was having a whiskey. I can't have this thing behind me, man. I can't have this thing behind me and not have a drink.
But if I can comment on that,
sure.
it's so, as we said already, this seems to be, in some way, shape, or form, this seems to be happening to a lot of people. And I agree. It's incredibly exciting that this is occurring, and that everyone, I sometimes characterize Bitcoin as a wealth transfer to the curious. And and the metaphor of Plato's cave is often invoked to describe, the world today, and maybe even coming out of it and seeing Bitcoin, or seeing God, or spirituality, or whatever it might be. But, we do seem to exist in a culture and a society where questioning has become a controversial, activity, and it's poo-pooed.
Conspiracy theorists, God damn you.
Yeah,
Don't
exactly.
ask questions.
Yeah. Right. You either have, and there's a source, there's an authority who's going to tell you with supposed certainty what is true and what is not true. And, that just doesn't fly for a lot of us. And like I said, I don't pretend to know much, but, I can also recognize when other people shouldn't be pretending to know much either. And I think there's much to be discovered and very little to be definitively known. And this is why, this is the process of using those things that we can rely on as good enough while we pursue greater understanding of all of them, right? So because you need a good enough, right? You need some foundational understandings to move forward, but having them all be updated, all the time, consistently, I think is super important if your desire is to have a perspective most grounded in clarity and truth as possible. And so, I mentioned psychedelics. I mean, Bitcoin in that way is kind of a psychedelic, and how much it changes your perspective on things, and how much it changes how you see the world, and how much it changes how you engage the world. And, other interesting analogies in terms of the values that it propagates and that kind of stuff. But
well, John, if I could just jump in there, sorry. So I know very little about psychedelics. Could you teach us a little bit about your journey through that and what it means to you?
Sure. First disclaimer is that
this is not healthy.
I mean, and well, not that, but this is not a cop out either, but words are simply, I won't try to describe the experience itself. It's an ineffable experience, and call it a mystical experience or an altered state of consciousness, whatever you want to describe that as. It's impossible to articulate it with words. If it's done correctly, there's many different ways that people have approached it. But I mean, the short version is human beings seem inevitably drawn to things that perturb their consciousness. And it would seem that throughout history, almost everywhere in the world, there's always been methods of accessing states of consciousness that allow you to put on hold for a period of time your kind of ego, singular perspective self, and access a perspective or a consciousness that is less tethered to the peculiarities or the particulars of your own personality and individual perspective. And as a result of that, allows you to see things differently because they're not, so closely tied to your own emotions and your own experiences and your own conditioning and that kind of stuff. And there's, I think there's probably a reason for that. I think that is part of the reason for that is because there's a value in that. There's a value in not identifying who you are 100% with the conditioning that you've received, right? Like, I use an overly simplified example, but if I was born in one of the Amazon villages that I traveled to in 08 and 09, I would probably be a different person before you today, right? I'd be speaking differently. I would have different beliefs. I'd have different preferences in terms of food and all that kind of jazz. So it begs the question, well, who am I beyond the associations and conditioning that I received as a result of, the environment and nation and family and all that kind of stuff in which I grew up, and I think those are all valid and they're all important. And but I think it's important also to be aware that they're somewhat transient or somewhat dependent upon conditions, right? What is not dependent upon conditions? What is your awareness untethered from your the things you associate with who you are? And all sorts of wisdom and spiritual and religious traditions throughout the ages have explored these questions, and most of them come up with something akin to there's a universal awareness or an experience of oneness that lies beyond our association with our name and our preferences. That is something like pure awareness and pure consciousness, or ego death, a lack of a consciousness without an ego. And these cultures throughout the history of the world have pursued practices, whether it be fasting, rhythmic dancing, sweat lodges, psychoactive plants, to facilitate that experience, being able to enter into that state of mind for a period of time to access the insights and the perspectives and the wisdom that it may hold, and then come back down to a more, let's say, grounded perspective, and hopefully imbue that grounded perspective and your normal waking awareness with some of the wisdom to be derived from there. And one of them might simply be to know that you are not necessarily your thoughts, right? You're not necessarily all your preferences. That's an aspect of you, and you're not necessarily your ego. And look, and it's something to be engaged rather than something to assume is you. So when I'm doing a workout with someone, or if I'm in the gym with someone and we want to throw down and be competitive, I like fully engage that motherfucker, that ego, right? Because like I want to win. And I think, but if I'm having a different type of experience, maybe I want to dial it down, and maybe I want a more unifying perspective. And what I think these experiences deliver to you is the ability to recognize the separation, and then have some sort of ability to apply it to change how you apply it in whatever circumstance you may be in. So to apply that type of wisdom or that change in perspective based on the circumstance that you find yourself in, for a more optimized experience or a more optimized outcome. And, that's a very, it's a difficult thing to describe, but, like a lot of people find themselves that it's a very spiritual experience too. Like it kind of opens you up to the idea that there is some, for lack of a better term, higher power. And, what that means is up to every individual to determine. But in an era where so much egotism perhaps manifested externally in the primacy of the authority and power of the state, in an era where that's so prevalent, being humbled by a higher power can be a very healthy and beneficial experience, both for the individual and for the type of society that type of humility fosters. And so, from my perspective, just to sum it up, because I could talk about this stuff for hours, but I think those practices and pursuing them properly, carefully, with intention, but pursuing them is going to be integral to the full development of individuals as we move forward into an era that's hopefully more predicated on truth and what's real, and humility and honesty and all these things that we've been talking about. I think those practices will be integral to that. And it's interesting to see in the Bitcoin community, maybe because of a self-selection a la people were buying psychedelics on Silk Road, but I think almost more so because people in this space seem to be very open-minded. Like if you're really on a search for truth, then you're not going to arbitrarily close your mind off to any sort of information or knowledge that's out there. And I think there's a receptivity to saying, hey, we've been lied to a lot. Certain experiences have been closed off from us. And now that we're feeling a greater curiosity and a greater sense that we have the right and freedom to access them, let's have a look. Let's see if there's anything valid there. Maybe you decide for yourself there isn't. But I think what's interesting about the Bitcoin space is that there's such an open-mindedness around this culture that's emerging, that at least if there's something of value to be discerned, people are willing to give it its proper due and determining for themselves if that is indeed the case. And that's all we can ask for in the pursuit of truth.
It's quite interesting. You've mentioned ego a number of times there, and what I've taken from that is I haven't done psychedelics, but I'm an ultra marathon runner, and I found when I started ultra marathon running, I learned to keep. I had a big ego, but when I started running, in particular ultra marathons, I have learned to check my ego, and it's like I could be running 50, 60, 70 Ks, but my mind is somewhere else. Like it's amazing. It's the most. I'd say to my wife, like I'm going for therapy session, and I just go, and it's quite interesting that you talk about that with the psychedelics.
Well, first of all, that's awesome, and kudos to you. But that's an ordeal, right? And pain can humble you just as much as a lot of other things, and that's where the ego gets, you reorient it. Perhaps you gain a different perspective on it when you're humbled. It doesn't matter if it's God or the road doing the humbling. There's a similar quality between the two, and and a lot of these ancient practices that I was just referring to, many of them are not psychoactive in the traditional sense at all. They're ordeal poisons. So in a lot of cultures, they will provide. The ceremonies will be poisons that bring the participants kind of close to death. But the point is to contextualize the experience of pain and challenge in a safe enough way, but also in a serious enough way that the humility and the benefits of that are imparted properly. And
Yeah.
so, there's more than one way to skin a cat, but for my tastes and preferences and stuff like that, I mean, I've found that the proper, ritualistic, let's say, use of psilocybin is intermittently, on an annual or biannual or whatever basis, is a very good way to kind of clean house, to review who you are at that moment in time and what you've been doing, and get a different look on it that you might not have on a day-to-day basis. And you can assess on how you're doing on the things that you want to pursue and on the person you want to become. And I think they're tremendously beneficial. And I have very little doubt that in a hyper Bitcoinized world, these practices there will be a revival of them, and hopefully even a further development of them. And they'll be treated with the same type of reverence that they've been treated for, millennia of our history.
So John, in terms of the shared consciousness that we have potentially in the world today, and what you talk about, in some ways it's the complete opposite of the question I was asking before, which is, what is the life summary that you have that brought you to this position to understand the value of Bitcoin? The complete opposite end of that spectrum is like, when you drop everything, we have a shared consciousness between us. How many Bitcoiners do you think perhaps have understood in some deep-seated way this conscious level that exists, and are then therefore drawn to this new type of social hierarchy that's being built? Is that connected in any way? And it's funny how suddenly we've gone from being like, I was asking about, like, basically it's the nature versus nurture concept is how I'm thinking about it. And nurture is basically all of our life decisions. And, I grew up in the UK, I went to school in the UK, and I then moved abroad, and all these different touch points create the way that you think. But then maybe just at the very base of all of that, nature itself is this high level consciousness that we all share. And if you're willing to feel that that's there in some way, then it leads you down this path towards what is this new thing called Bitcoin. Is it connected in any way? And have I synthesized that appropriately at all?
Well, could you put a little more meat on the shared consciousness bone? Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, it's a concept that you're teaching me for arguably one of the first times. It's something that my mum has spoken about for years, and I arguably don't pay enough attention to what she's talking about from a spirituality perspective. But this idea that you just touched on, which is when you strip away all of the preferences that we have as individuals and the name that we have as individuals, and perhaps this is connected to the meditation I've been trying to do more and more of recently, where you basically like, nothing else exists except for this one moment right now. And as soon as you get into that headspace, you aren't a preference set, you aren't a name. I'm not sure if I'm coming up with an actual question here. I'm just thinking conceptually about what you're talking
thinking
about.
out loud.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's cool. Keep thinking, and maybe we'll find the thread.
No, it's really just like thinking about how Bitcoin is very radical, and most people don't seem to trust it at this point, mainly because of the touch points they're being referred to, which is, oh, it's crashed, or you can't possibly trust something that's not government money, et cetera, et cetera. But for people to take that step through to the next point, which is actually, this makes a lot of sense. How relevant is that to this level of consciousness you're talking about?
That's
and even then, maybe
question.
That's not a question, is it? I'm
Well, I mean, whether it is or not, it isn't. It inspired a thought in my mind. So, who cares really? But, it's an interesting question. And in Money Messiah, one of the outlandish assertions that I make is that I think the enterprise of religions have always been like, the question is whether, and look, religion and religious institutions get co-opted by imperfect people, right? So they're definitely worthy of all the criticisms they've gotten, especially in the modern era. But I don't think it's rational to therefore discredit the entire enterprise. This has been integral and central enterprise to every society that we've ever been able to unearth from ancient times up till today. There's always been a quote unquote religious element. And I think there has to be a reason why. The problem is when they become institutionalized, then they're susceptible to corruption, as all institutions are. But basically I think what they're trying to determine is how best to engage this reality, and it's really easy to, measure the length of a table, or, like the material world is far more easy to measure. And therefore, I think we've, as a result, focused too much on that at the exclusion of recognizing that the immaterial world, that, what our consciousness contends with in the realm of meaning and value and those sorts of things, is just as quote unquote real. It's just not material. And so I think the religious enterprise has been to try to discern the parameters of that place so that we can align with them optimally, because under the presumption that aligning with the parameters of reality allows you to move through it and experience it optimally. And I think that's a fairly rational assumption. And so I make the case that Bitcoin, I think a lot of these religious traditions, whether it be in the East or the West, or even, New Age sort of rhetoric, is that one, truth is often tantamount to God. It's either the road to God or it's interchangeable with God. Truth, love, and God are very often at the basis of most of these religious traditions. And then you pile on a bunch of other stuff that, maybe you don't need, maybe some people need, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, whatever. But at the base, it's often, truth, love, and God are almost they're almost synonyms. And, so, and then freedom, the assumption, or the assertion rather, that the divinity of the individual and treating each individual as sovereign and divine is the best basis by which to constitute an individual life and a society. With that basis, with that as, at the top of the hierarchy, not treating people as, a collective or a group. And I feel like, and if you study religious story and philosophy and that kind of stuff, I feel like those two primary values of truth and freedom, right, sovereignty, are teased out, come out of almost all of them. The wisdom that emerges from them is those two things. And so what does that mean about the structure of reality, at least to the extent that consciousness experiences it? I think it may mean that there's something valid about that wisdom or those insights. And it seems to me that Bitcoin's success, at least in part, is due to the fact that those are the two principles or values by which it operates. And I think also as why so much value has accrued and will continue to accrue to it, because it uses incorruptible truth to foster and deliver an inviolable sovereignty. Maybe not of like a total sovereignty of your physical self, but over the thing that is, aside from your physical body, the highest density representation of value that you have access to, which is your money. So, that's why
that's just fucking, that is just unbelievable. It's so true though. It's unbelievably true. It just makes so much sense. Like when you put it like that, it's just.
I think it's part of the reason why there's a lot of this religious language around Bitcoin and this emergence of religious thought around Bitcoin, is because in it are represented the same fundamental truths and wisdom that has emerged in every great religion or school of philosophy throughout time, no matter where in the world it is to be found. It's the same principles fostering the same benefit, let's say. But this time, rather than just having to take it on faith that other people are operating with the same, adhering to the same values as you, let's say the wisdom of Christ, for example, you just kind of have to take it on faith that, well, are you going to play by those rules? I'll play by those rules. And maybe it still benefits me to do so. Maybe that's the best way to engage reality, but you don't have much certainty if anyone else is playing by the same rules. Now, those same rules are being deployed because of how closely they align, let's say, with the reality we experience. But now you can actually verify that other people are adhering to them as well. It doesn't have to be taken on faith. And so that's a really interesting, it's almost, again, the reason why the idea of the Messiah emerges, because it's a manifestation of the divine in the world. And that's what the Messiah character in the character of Jesus was, whether he was a real person or not, or just a narrative symbol. And as insane as it sounds, I think, well, I try to make the case in the piece at least, and probably far more articulately than I'm making it here now, that there seems to be a similar emergence happening around Bitcoin. And so with all that being said, to answer your question, I think it's interesting that we have, on the one hand, an immutable, inviolable, those principles, let's say truth and freedom as a representation. And then we have human psychology as sporadic and erratic as it is, bumping up against that thing, both as individuals and then taken together as a collective or as a culture or society. And so it's like, I see the volatility in Bitcoin and the ups and downs and all that stuff. It's just our consciousness trying to come to terms with that degree of absoluteness and that degree of the elevation and the manifestation of these principles in the highest fidelity form than we've ever been able to apprehend them. And, so no wonder it's causing this dramatic effect on our minds. And no wonder it's causing this reorganization of how we perceive value and determine principles and derive clarity and all that kind of stuff. And so it really is, in that sense, it's a tool for the refinement of our consciousness, and all the better that it is unchanging. And as a result of that, it requires us to change, because it's, if this side of the equation can't change, then the only thing that can is this one. And so, and I see that as happening. And just a final point of interest that I've been exploring lately is, I mentioned that a lot of Bitcoiners are finding God, for lack of a more, for lack of a better term, but like, there's a lot of interest in returning to Christianity in particular. And as I said, like, I have the utmost respect for a lot of these traditions, and I think there's a lot of wisdom contained in them. But my own approach here is, I feel like, a God or a spiritual impulse as well. I think that's an integral part of the totality of our experience of being. But there is a reason why they fell out of favor in the world. And I don't think we should neglect why that is. And obviously there's many reasons, right? The ascension of state power is definitely a part of that. But I think we're at a unique point in our history here where, for the first time, we have a globally immediately connected world, right? Here in Australia, I'm over here, we're really far away, but here we are having this conversation and sharing these ideas. And now we have that world connected and grounded and unified in these godly type principles. And I think we should be, even though there may be an impulse to immediately gratify that, God-shaped hole in our heart, to use a common phrase, and fill it with something that's already been developed off the shelf. I think, and this makes this whole thing even way more significant, of course, but I think we're on the precipice of witnessing the emergence of the next iteration of the religious enterprise that has been part of our experience of life for our entire history. And so I think, even though there's a lot of utility to be derived from, let's say, especially in this culture today, where there's so much nihilism and so much fear and so much anger and all that stuff, like, there's a lot, that to be taken from the Christian faith, let's say, that can be useful in confronting a lot of that stuff. But I think what would be even more valuable longer term, we talk about low time preference in this place all the time, would be not being too hasty there. Now we have access to all the wisdom traditions of the past, be they shamanic, be they Eastern and, Buddhist and Taoism and all of, the traditions. And we have the emergence and manifestation of something that seems to be imbued with a lot of those qualities. It's going to shake us up a lot. And we're the initial cohort that's feeling this the most. Let's see what emerges from our process of engagement with this thing, as well as our process of that hunger we were talking about before. We're hungry for information. We're hungry for insight. We're hungry to refine our perspective. Let's see what happens there. Maybe it takes 10 years, maybe it takes 100 years. But I think what lies on the back end of that is ultimately a better distillation of what that religious enterprise has always been, which is trying to orient ourselves and trying to develop a better perspective by which to confront our experience of reality. Nothing is more important than that, really. I mean, that's why it's been such a central pursuit. And so I think that's the level on which things are happening here. But I think we should be careful not to gratify it too quickly and allow it to emerge rather than to impose a solution too hastily on it.
I know we both, you're short for time, I'm short for time. I've got a meeting after this. I just want to switch gears from like gear 5 to gear 2. We're a very young podcast. I mean, we're in our second season. Our first season was just about us telling our stories and our journeys. Second season's been, I mean, you're our 5th or 6th guest. I mean, how long you been doing your show, and how many episodes have you done, and have you got any tips for us or guide?
I started it in the fall of 2019. I have no idea how many episodes I've done. And I mean, the only thing I can say is what my experience has been, you know, and take it or leave it. I don't assume that this advice is applicable beyond myself, but I've never, this might sound bad, I've never cared about, I'm not an educator, I guess is the way I usually put it. Like I'm not trying to educate people here. I'm not on a mission to spread the gospel, as it were. This is all for me. And, you know, it's to connect with people who I can have beneficial conversations with, to refine mutually, of course, in a proper dialogue, our perspectives on things, and share our ideas, and hopefully finish the conversation better than when I entered it. And I share it for 2 reasons. One, because, you know, in the world we live in, you know, the larger scale you have, maybe the more access you have to certain people. And if you really want those conversations, then you need access to people that you can have them with. And 2, on the off chance that people find it interesting or entertaining or helpful in any way. And so that, you know, it's always, you can fall into the trap. You know, I've certainly felt myself going off course in this regard, you know, throughout the course of the last 2 years of doing this, 2.25 years. You can think like, oh, well, who should I have on to, who are people going to like, or who should I have on to hit bigger numbers, or this or that. And you know, I catch myself doing it very early, like, but I still find it so gross, because like, what's the point? You know, why do you want to do it for anybody else?
We did it for just to document our journey for our kids, you know, so our kids can see this. And all we wanted to do was just touch one person. I mean, I don't know how many we've touched. We've definitely touched people. And now it's just really for our learning and growth. And we're just taking people along for the ride. I mean, you know, whoever wants to talk to us, talk. And we don't go chasing, but it's been pretty cool. It's been an amazing experience.
Well, that's awesome.
Jigsy described it, John, and said, as soon as it feels like a job, I'm not doing it.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the way to do it. And the kicker here is that it ends up working out best that way anyways, because what everyone, you know, we're talking about truth and authenticity at the beginning of this thing. Like, what people are here for is to refine themselves, to develop, to engage in that hopeful future better than they otherwise might have, you know. And there's this very aggressive desire to learn, refine, grow, all this kind of stuff. And if that's what you're doing, and all you're doing is sharing your journey, whether it be an intellectual or spiritual or whatever, then that's going to be appealing and valuable to other people who are doing the same. If you're always trying to, you know, growth hack and figure out what's hot in the moment, or, you know, the breaking news jazz or whatever, like, if that's your thing, fine. But for me, it's always like, I never wanted anything from it other than my own refinement or my own intellectual stimulation. And the fact that, you know, some people have been interested enough in it that I actually get to do it, and it's not such an opportunity cost for my time and what I otherwise might do. Like, that's awesome, you know. And I'm very grateful that I get to like read books and read articles and talk to really smart people all the time. And then on top of that is contribute to the emergence of a culture. You know, I think that's what's actually happening here. Like, all these conversations, all this Twitter stuff, is all this information just smashing around. And as it does, slowly but surely, a culture starts to emerge and principles start to become refined, and attitudes and perspectives, like it all gets mashed together and refined. It's like, carving a marble statue, right? It's just a big lump of stone initially, and then slowly but surely it takes form. And I think that's what's happening here. And I think this culture, I mean, if we believe really in hyper Bitcoinization, then I think the culture that Bitcoin fosters is going to be the dominant global culture at some point in the future. Yeah. And I don't want to be too self-aggrandizing or self-important here, but like, I think what this initial, like all of us that are currently in Bitcoin, what we're doing is we're like the first people that are involved in determining what that culture is going to look like, what that culture values, what rituals it has, what principles it upholds the most, all that kind of stuff. And by virtue of the fact that you're out there having these conversations and connecting with people, you just get to be involved in it more, which is a tremendous gift, man. Because I'll tell you, like, when you end up going to meet space stuff like Bitcoin conferences and whatever, and people already know a little bit what you're about because I've heard your perspective on podcasts and whatever, or on Twitter, it's really fucking cool. Like I talk about it a lot, but when I was at Bitcoin 2021 in Miami last year, it was so cool to meet all these people that you're just on such a similar wavelength with.
We were locked in. We weren't allowed to come.
And all these people that you don't even know, that connect with you, like that must be crazy. I mean, I saw you doing an interview with two of my favorites, Greg Foss and Preston Pish. And I'll be trying to chase one of them down. I love Preston. I think he's so cool. I just love his voice. I actually love just listening to his podcast when I go to bed because his voice is just so.
It's an amazing experience, isn't it?
Someone did a remix recently. It was like one of these nature sound, like bedtime tracks. But they mixed in, like every 5 minutes, Sailor would come in with like a couple of his one-liners or something like that, and then he'd fade out and we'd go back to the nature sounds. That's
pretty cool. Well, thanks very much. I've got to bail. But thank you so much for your time. We've really enjoyed it, learned a lot. It's really changed the direction of our podcast or interviews as well. So we got to hear something completely different. So very cool. Thanks for your time, man.
Yeah, John, been great to become Twitter friends and able to organize this and learn a bit more about yourself. And those are certainly some mind-bending perspectives that, I mean, I'm going to be thinking about it all day long. I'm just about to go to the gym for sure. I'm going to be there going,
I'm going to go research this. Is it psilocybin? Psilocybin,
yeah.
Psilocybin, yeah. I have to look into that.
Well, boys, I really appreciate it. It's been great to chat, and I love what you guys are doing. And, it's such a honor to be able to have these conversations with, people around the world that are seeing things this way and trying to effectuate a better future, so keep it up, and I'm sure our paths will cross at some point in the future.
How early are we?
We're really fucking early.
Thanks, John.
John, thanks, mate. Cheers.
All right, guys, take care. See ya.